Image. A Venn diagram, made up of two barely intersecting circles, one blue, one green. In the blue circle to the left is text which reads, what the author meant. The green circle on the right reads, what your English teacher thinks the author meant. Underneath the two circles, text. It reads as follows. For instance, the curtains were blue. What your teacher thinks. The curtains represent his immense depression and his lack of will to carry on. What the author meant, the curtains were fucking blue.
One of the things you have to deal with as you go through life is running into your own limitations. There is so much that I cannot do. But, I have several degrees in English literature, so much debt. And this is something I can do. I've seen this image or images very like it online literally for years, and so if nothing else, this video is an attempt to gain some much needed closure. Generally, discussion on this meme tends to fall into a couple of types. Firstly, which side is right, which side is wrong. Secondly, there is often discussion around exception cases or texts or situations which do or don't fit the typology outlined here. Now, both of those arguments are kind of limiting and not particularly interesting to me, so what I want to try and do in this video is talk about the presuppositions that underlie this diagram, why those presuppositions might be right, why they might be wrong, and hopefully suggest a more interesting way of working out just what those curtains mean than depending upon what we think the author meant. Okay, so on one side of this argument, there's the idea that the curtains are blue. That's all they are, and that's all they signify. Nothing less, certainly nothing more. There is a bit of me that sympathizes with this attitude to language that we could describe as being broadly functionalist. A equals A. That's all. Now, if you take the logic of this argument seriously, then language itself simply becomes a series of descriptive labels that we can pin onto objects in the external world. And the reason that I'm sympathetic to this is that it generally reflects how a lot of communication, both verbal and written, kind of works, right? If I come up to you at the bus stop and ask, when is the next bus, and you tell me it's not for an hour, then I'm not going to desperately parse your words for what you really mean and how it relates to the existential angst of your first lost great love. And the reason this meme is convincing is because it chimes with a lot of our experiences of day-to-day communication, one in which meaning is easily communicated and understood. But even communication which we think is very straightforward and easily understood can be subject to misunderstandings, as demonstrated by the notable philosopher of language, Paddington the Bear. There is also the possibly apocryphal story of a certain computer company rewriting their instructions to say press spacebar to continue because too many customers were ringing up their helpline to complain that their computer didn't seem to have an any key. And what about what we might term non-functionalist language? What does it refer to say, I love you? There doesn't seem to be any singular concrete object out there in the world that this points to, but rather a deeper series of histories and associations and meanings that have to be interpreted if that phrase is to have the full depth of meaning that we think it does. Essentially, if you really commit to the logic of when you see the curtains, it doesn't mean anything else, then we would live in a world of instructions and signs, forms, but one in which poetry would be completely impossible. Okay, by this point you might be like, alright John, I get what you're saying, language is ambiguous and thus requires interpretation. But is it always? Well, if one side of this diagram presupposes that poetic language is essentially impossible, then the problem with the other side of this diagram is that It presupposes that essentially all language is poetic, laden with symbolism and resonance. If I asked you directions to the grocery store, and you responded with, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through half-deserted streets, the mutterings retreat of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit." I would not think of that as useful directions because I would have to spend so much time interpreting and trying to decode what you've said that this is not meaningful communication. And this brings up another aspect that this meme doesn't quite cover. Not only is language a matter of interpretation, but language is contextual. And honestly, this is maybe the thing that annoys me the most about the whole "the curtains were blue" discourse, because it implies that the way that we come to understand or interpret anything that's even vaguely symbolic is by stripping it of its context and any connection that it might have to a larger artistic work or totality. The blue curtains might be hanging in the nursery of a family home bought by a newlywed couple, excitedly expecting their first child. The blue curtains might be in the same home a year later, in a nursery that's never been used as the blue fades under a layer of undisturbed dust. The curtains are still blue, but what the curtains might mean and what they might symbolize is dependent upon the wider relations in which that symbolic detail is embedded. And this brings up maybe the biggest point. Who is entitled to say whether a certain word or phrase or detail is symbolic? Who is entitled to try and assert the deeper meaning of a symbol or even an artistic work as a whole? Well, according to this meme, there is one person: the author. Both sides of this diagram are, in essence, arguments about what an author really meant when they created a certain work. I mean, who has the right to determine what a work means better than the author who created it? So really, this is a second-order argument about who is interpreting the author's intentions correctly. Your English teacher or you? Now, it's a pretty common argument to say that authorial intention doesn't matter at all, and honestly for pretty good reason. Even if you find a letter or a diary entry that says, "I meant this book to be scary," what you have in front of you is another text, which is full of language that has to be interpreted again, right? The big problem with looking to the author to tell you the final answer on what their work means is that it takes you as a reader away from the text itself. Now, that isn't to say that what the author meant is completely useless or should be disregarded entirely. I certainly wouldn't go that far. But it isn't, nor should it be, the final determining interpretation of what a given work means. Did the author really mean to include the curtains as being blue because their character was depressed? Well, maybe. Maybe not. Maybe they did it unconsciously, having absorbed the cultural connotations that connects blue with things like melancholia and grief and sadness. Even if you asked them, they may not be able to tell you directly what a certain symbol does or does not mean. And down in the description, there's a story about someone who tried to do exactly that. The whole point of trying to get away from the author as the site from which we get a singular correct interpretation of what a text means is to allow scope for the reader to emerge as the agent who generates meaning for themselves. Literature is not a puzzle that we solve and then move on to the next thing when we've got the right answer. But it is something that we as readers have to engage with. But we don't do that by breaking apart the symbolic into a series of molecules that we try and decode, but by trying to grasp the work of art as a whole, taking into account language and symbol, history and culture, to try and develop a critical understanding of what this text might mean here and now to us. And that doesn't mean that symbols can mean anything. Just because there may not be one singular correct answer doesn't mean that every other answer is correct. We have to form critical, evidenced interpretations for our engagement with art. The curtains were blue. So what does that mean? In the final instance, that's not up to the author. And it's certainly not up to your English teacher. But it might just be up to you.